As you all know, this is all common sense, and Professor Sargent has given us a heavy dose of common sense, and if you are a little bit lost, that is not surprising, because he is talking about some very important concepts and very versatile in terms of moving between the revolution days in the United States and Europe today. Will there be a revolution, do you think? It's not for us to decide, but would you predict? Would constitutions be rewritten in Europe today?
So can you hear me? Okay, so the truth of the matter is, I can't tell, and I'll tell you, economics is really economics and political science and what we call game theory. It's really bad at predicting anything about revolutions, and let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. So actually, John R. Hicks, a great economist, wrote a book called A Theory of Economic History. And you'll see him struggling. It's the one thing he can't predict. He can't struggle. And here's the reason. So stick with me if you're not an economist. Because this is simple. If you're an economist, this will be clear to you. In economics, we have a notion of equilibrium. It's basically the same notion in general equilibrium theory or game theory. So here's what it is in game theory. What a game is, technically, well, if you play games, you know. Okay, it's a description, it's a list of players. It's a description of who chooses what when. And it's a list of the payoffs that each player gets as a function of what everybody else does. So you could ask, does that describe cricket? Check. Does it describe, American football? Yeah. Soccer? Yeah. Any game is like that. So what economists and game theorists have is they have an equilibrium concept. And here's what the equilibrium concept is. It's each player in the game is doing the best for himself given what the other players are doing, who are all doing the best for themselves given what... So think about it. Everybody's doing the best that they can given these rules. So now you kind of ask, so this is an equilibrium in the sense it's robust. Nobody kind of wants to, given the rules that are there, nobody wants to move. And so if you kind of read history, what you'll find is like, you read French history before the French Revolution, and you could kind of see that was an equilibrium. And people tried to break it. And everybody who tried to break it, advisors to the king, they got smashed by the other players. I mean, the ancient regime was very robust and our equilibrium concept. So what we know how to do, I'll just tell you what we know, and I don't care who you are. Al Roth, Drew Fudenberg, David Krebs, the greatest game theorists, they don't know how to, you go write them. They know how to analyze what goes on within one equilibrium. They can't figure out, they can't tell you how you're going to move from one game to another game, where you kind of rip things up and change the rules. And if you actually study revolutions, they're hard to figure out what's going on. And so the answer is, I don't know. So if you ask, and I heard someone ask Gerhard Schroeder, he gave his recommendation. He doesn't say revolution, but he wants a new constitution. And if someone asks, well, do you think this is going to happen? He said, I have no idea. So this is the hardest thing for us to figure out.
Okay. I'll open up to see if there are questions from the audience. Please raise your hand first. One. Right here in the middle. Third row. Third row.
If they don't have questions, I have a question. And I think it's only fair.
Hello, I'm a student of economics, so this is a very simple question. I would just want to go back to what you said in the very beginning. When you were defining currency unions, you were talking about also, US dollars in Ecuador and Zimbabwe. So that made me think last weekend I went to Macau and I went to a casino and I couldn't use any Macau dollars. I had to use Hong Kong dollars. So would you define Macau and Hong Kong being in a currency union?
That's a great question.
Let me. You could not use it in the casino. Yeah, but you could use Macau dollars out on the street.
Yeah. And Hong Kong dollars as well.
Yes.
So I have a paternal question to ask you. What are you doing in a casino when you're a graduate student? Why weren't you studying? Anyway, that's not that. Okay. So the reason it's a great question is who decides? Question is, who decides when we're in a currency union? Is it the government or is it the people? So it's interesting, the people inside that casino, they kind of voted. You know, the owners of that casino kind of made a little move. And if enough people in Macau make that move, something's going to happen. So if you start thinking about that, okay, when you are my age, the dollar, and I don't want to think about when you are my age, I will be, no, I don't want to think about that. So the US dollar will not be the world, the dominant international currency. It will not be. I have some ideas about what will be, but it will not be the US dollar. Now, who's going to decide that? It's going to be like this situation that you said. It's governments aren't going to decide it. And, you know, there's a little shadow of this, you know, this Bitcoin thing, where private, it's, the markets get ahead of governments sometimes, so. It's actually a great question. And of course, my answer is I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. We stop here. Yeah, here.
Hello, Professor. I'm also an economics and finance student, year one. As you know, recently there's a hot debate about whether Scotland should remain in the UK with England and Northern Ireland. So, and they suggest that they will still continue to use the pound sterling, but without any imposed policies from the Westminster. So what do you think about it? Because I think that's quite a great suggestion. You use the same currency but without any restrictions, so it would prevent kind of systematic failure. I know the Westminster wouldn't be happy with it anyway.
So I don't know why you're asking me this. So these are dynamite questions if you kind of think about, you know, where I don't want to. So if you think like the United States has fought a civil war about how many. We didn't decide we were going to be a union until after a civil war, and it was a terrible thing. And Britain's done close to that before. So these are really tough questions. Next question.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor Sargent. Thanks for your interesting talk. I'm a PhD student in finance, and I have a question about deficits. You just talked about in US, the central government has a high deficit, but the local governments cannot have any deficit. But the case in China is just the opposite. I'm wondering what's your insight into the status in China, and what's the impact in the country's growth and the citizens' well-being. Thank you.
So I have a rule. a personal rule. So about how Americans should behave when they go abroad. So I'm going to answer questions and make criticisms of other countries' fiscal policy as soon as my own country's fiscal policy is in order and I can give examples from my own country. But right now I can't. But your question is a really good one. And actually, countries like Brazil and Argentina have had similar problems. And actually, they are related to my little stories about those two bailouts. They're actually vitally related in terms of the message. The bailouts are, they usually have a quid pro quo. And if they don't, the person doing the bailing out is foolish or overly optimistic about human nature. I say this as someone who's made personal bailouts. Anyway. So when do I get to ask some questions? I have some questions.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for your speech. My question was that the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, like the South Asian countries, they have had this idea of a currency union. I mean, of course, South Asia is completely unstable right now. There's a lot of, border disputes and economic problems going on. But the idea did come up. So what lesson can the South Asian countries take from the European currency crisis? Thank you.
Wow, that's a great question. So, I spent the afternoon talking with my friend Yule about ambiguity. So if you look at, so my lesson would be, okay, so this is something for political scientists and historians to study. So economists and game theorists have when we have our equilibrium concept, we have the world's very orderly, and plans are very concrete. And like if you solve a game, we use backward induction. People can form expectations. Strategies are well defined on all events, and so on. If you look at, and then we can understand what happens. So when I solve a macro model, what I do is it's vitally important for the citizens inside the little economy that I built to understand what government policies are. And so I'll write down complete descriptions of government policies on all contingencies and so on. And then I need that to solve the model. Okay, so now if you look at the quote-unquote real world, and you look how political negotiations are conducted, what's often done is Congresses or presidents, they agree on some things and they leave some things open. So you kind of read the laws and it's not a complete description of the plan, like U.S. fiscal policy. And I can document this by looking, I study history. You go back and look how the U.S. went on the gold standard. It was the messiest thing you ever saw. Very haphazard. And what happens is, I think the loose thing is Congresses get together and there's some dispute. And to have a coherent policy, you've got to decide, if you decide A, you also have to decide B in one way. Well, instead of being coherent, they say, we can agree on this now, we can't agree on these other things, so let's just agree on what we can agree on now, and then later we'll decide some things. And that's what Maastricht did. It's completely, you couldn't tell what the currency union was. So for example, was it a currency union where the Italians were going to be forced to behave like Germans? Or was it one where the Germans were going to bail them out? You could not tell. And there was a lot of ambiguity left. And you could say, well, that wasn't harmful. Well, it's sure harmful now because we don't know what the currency union is. And now it's being decided not in the peaceful times when we kind of had time. It's, okay, they said, let's postpone this until later when we can't agree. Now it has to be decided, but much more has to be decided. So my advice is what you can learn is don't be like Europe. But my friend Milton Friedman would say that, well, he would say if he was here, he said, Tom, that's not much advice. He said, because there's an infinite number of ways you could not be like Europe. But anyway.
One question here and then.
Hi, Professor. You know, the Hong Kong has a currency ball system, and the Hong Kong dollar is backed by with the US dollar, and also the Hong Kong dollar insurance is backed by US dollar. So what's the really difference between currency board system and the currency union? Is that a special case or?
That's a beautiful question. So I'm just reading a book about this. I would say there's not much difference. Okay, I would say it's the following. I love these. It says, where's George Washington? I would say it's advertising. I would say it's advertising. There's no George Washington. There's this lion. It's just free advertising. So I actually read a book. It's by Michael Grant. It's about Roman history through the coins. And it's all about advertising. It's about what did the emperors want to say about themselves through their coins. Right? This is back. So I would say this is a warehouse certificate for U.S. dollars. I'd say not much difference. And actually, I don't know if you remember, in the 1970s, there was a proposal in Israel to dollarize. And then the Prime Minister of Israel came out against it. It was Golda Meir. Said, you can't, we don't want, we want young Israelis to be looking at pictures of Israelis, not George Washington. So it's the advertising. Oh, she also wanted to say, I want to use the printing press to finance a lot of inflation so I can. Yeah, Hong Kong's very smart. It gets the seniorage. The Hong Kong government gets the seniors. Actually, when interest rates are high, because I'm holding this and I'm getting 0% interest, and when interest rates are high, the Hong Kong monetary holding is holding treasury bills that are yielding 5%, and it's pocketing the difference. And actually, if you looked at the accounts, they built up a lot of seniors that way. It's a very clever system. It's actually a system that the British set up. It was set up by the British to make to spread sterling. And I'll make you a bet they're not too happy that it's backed by dollars now.
Thank you.
Actually, there's a great book on that. It's called The Battle of Bretton Woods, and it's all about the struggle of the United States to. It's not a very nice picture of my country to make the dollar the international currency and not the pound. And the United States used some events in World War II to make that happen.
Would you let the lady go first?
Professor, I was wondering, do you think there will ever be a global currency, or if so, a dominant one? And if so, which country would that be? Or do you think we would go back to, say, the gold standard?
So that's a great question, and it's related to this question about Macau. And so the gold standard was kind of a universal currency. So it's like you're going to see that I'm basically useless, because I'm going to say there's things on both sides. So there's big benefits to having a world currency. There's also costs, because governments like to monkey around with currencies, because they can use it. You can use a currency to tax people you can't reach by any other means. So in Brazil, when they had their big inflation, they're taxing the poorest citizens of that country. You can tax people who are holding this where you can't tax them any other way. So if you kind of look at monetary history, it's a struggle between people that want a stable currency and people who want to use a currency to tax. So what's going to happen? I have my own personal prediction what the global currency is going to be. not worth as much as yours. But I think the way it's going to happen, I love the Macau example. To relate to the Bitcoin example, it's like governments weren't involved. And so an example would be governments try to do things. I don't know if you know, like during the Civil War, the United States went off the gold standard. We printed greenbacks. It was very controversial. We printed greenbacks and we went off gold. And we actually wrote laws that some people would think they were unconstitutional. We just violated contracts like everything. And then we made stuff like this. Not this stuff. It wasn't backed by anything. Greenbacks. Instead of saying, I promise to pay gold, it said, in God we trust. And then we're going to print a lot of it. Trust, we're going to print a lot of it. So, and contracts, federal courts were supposed to enforce contracts in this stuff. So if I owed you gold, I could now pay you this. And fine. California courts, California said, remember that was where the gold rush was? California said, In California, state taxes are due. California courts wouldn't honor that. So we went to an Oregon courts wouldn't. So the country split apart in terms of its monetary standing. And that's kind of like this Macau thing. It's like Abraham Lincoln said this was legal tender. California said, I don't care. So how these things emerge is really interesting. And you guys are lucky because you're going to be able to see some really interesting things in future years. See, I would watch this.
Okay, work hard.
Good afternoon. I'd like to ask about what do you think about the IMF? They kind of act in the same way. They go to countries, bail them out, and then dictate terms. How do you see this problem? Or is it a problem? I don't think they change constitutions, but they still dictate terms.
So it's really interesting. Actually, this book, The Battle of Bretton Woods, is about the founding of the IMF. I don't know. I would say the IMF is supposed to be the bad guy. So my model of the IMF is, I don't know if you had this. So did you ever have this? You're a kid, and you're doing all sorts of, your mom's at home, and you're doing all sorts of stuff that you're not supposed to do. And your mom says, wait till your father gets home. That's the IMF. That's what they're supposed to do. And they were set up to do this. They're set up to do some conditional bailouts, but at a cost. And they have a doctrine. So I've talked to people that work in governments that where the country hates the IMF, they say in public. But the people inside the government actually want the IMF to come in and tell them to do things. So they use the IMF to realign political arrangements. It's a good question. But it's joining the IMF is like being a policeman.
Well, we'll have one more last question before we break up.
I get the question.
Oh, okay.
I get the question. So sincerely. Okay, so let me ask you two questions. Can we take a vote? How many people think governments should pay their debts?
This is a Chinese audience.
It's actually a minority. How many think central governments should bail out subordinate governments? Interesting. How many people own U.S. government bonds? No, I'm just kidding.
Great. One more question before we let you go. One more last question. Okay, gentleman there. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor. When you talk about the reason about countries whether to join or exit the currency union, I guess you are mainly talking about the strategic interaction concern. When the country are deciding whether to join or exit the currency union, they are considering other countries' regulations. They are financing their own country's debts or projects. But from the basic knowledge of game theory, we can know that equilibrium in game can be a bad equilibrium. For example, prisoner's dilemma. So is there any benchmark that can measure the aggregate welfare of the countries? I mean, whether forming a currency union can promote the aggregate welfare of all the countries. Is there such kind of measure? Thank you.
So my instinct is, my instinct is this is a microeconomic question. And there's a great deal of heterogeneity within countries, and there's winners and losers. So, so rather than focusing, the best thing you can think of is a Pareto frontier, and you're moving, even if you're efficient, you're moving across it. So, so the answer is I don't know. I mean, if you look at, just look at Greece. There's huge winners and losers within that country about whether to stay in or stay out. So it's not going to be an unambiguous yes within any country or across countries. And that's why it's a really interesting problem. But that's why I'm personally wary when I see somebody say the best thing to do is this. You have to ask best for whom. And this is a situation where there's borrowers and lenders, and you're adjusting interest rates. When interest rates go up, it's great for lenders and bad for borrowers. So that's the human condition.
Well, before we wrap up, I just want to say a few words. The topic is really about, that you promised to talk about is currency crisis. You gave us not just currency crisis, but how you think, how you teach us to think, and how thoughtful a person you are. Thank you very much, Professor Sargent.